Hi, my name is Ryan. Today I'm experimenting with different types of epoxy resin. So resin for crafting and making things is pretty expensive, but these are some cheap options, not meant to be used for what resin's usually used for. You have your automotive fiberglass resin, which is supposed to be used with fiberglass sheets for fixing car body panels. We have wood hardener, which is technically an epoxy resin, but it's dissolved in a solvent, and this is meant to be used on rotting wood and stuff like that to make it stronger. And these are epoxy adhesives, which are meant to be mixed up and used for little repairs. None of these are supposed to be used for making things on their own, but we're going to experiment and see if any of them are useful for that. So we have our delightful little experiment vessels, which are these fake wine glasses. So we're going to do 4 different experiments. So we have 4 different resins, 4 cups each, 4 different experiments each. We're going to see how they react with black acrylic paint. We'll see how they react with blue acrylic paint to see if they hold the brighter color better. Going to see how they react with black watercolor paint, see if it's any better or worse than the acrylic. And then we're going to use blue jello to see if that can color it blue. I tried to find food coloring, but for some reason the grocery store didn't have any, so I grabbed jello. So first off, we're going to use the fiberglass resin for vehicles. This stuff is usually used in automotive body repair and comes in 2 parts. It comes in the actual resin and the hardener. It has to be mixed to harden. If you don't mix them, they'll never harden. Issues with this for using it for crafting purposes, it's a little bit brown. It is clear, but it's brown, so it's not very pleasant looking. I'm hoping the paint will change that. Black acrylic. Blue acrylic. My plan for all the 2-stage resins is to pour the resin first, mix it with the color, and then mix the hardener after, so I have more working time. Okay, so I haven't put the hardener in, but so far it looks like the paints are doing pretty good and the jello is doing nothing. So next up is this dollar store epoxy, $1.75 a piece, 25 mils. So these really cheap little epoxy tubes are actually the most expensive option by volume, but if you're just doing one little tiny piece and you don't want a whole 1-liter tub, this might be a good option. So for both of these tubes, they're designed to put out both the hardener and the epoxy at the same time. I'm going to try to cut this at the top here so I can do one at a time for the mixing. So I don't know which half is the epoxy and which half is the hardener, so I'm just going to guess and pick one half. I'll squeeze one side of the tube, mix, squeeze the other side of the tube, mix, and then repeat. There's air bubbles in this, which makes it spit sometimes, so be aware of that if you're trying to mix these. So the one with jello is actually kind of hard to mix. It made it a lot thicker. So next up is the Armor Coat Clear Epoxy, which should be basically the same thing as the dollar store epoxy, but this stuff costs $5 for a tube, making this our most expensive option. This side does label which part's epoxy and which part's hardener, so I'm going to use the epoxy part first for the mix. This stuff is really thick. Now, dollar store stuff is definitely easier to work with. The thickness of this could be a good thing if you don't want it to move very much while it's drying, like it's in a weird spot, but it definitely makes it hard to mix. The watercolor paint thinned it quite a bit. I suspect the jello will do the opposite. That's pretty cool. Turned it basically white. Okay, now we're doing the wood hardener, which is supposed to be used to repair and strengthen wood by applying it with a brush. 20 bucks for a can of this. It's a little bit more expensive than the automotive fiberglass, and I suspect that this is going to shrink quite a lot when it dries, because this is a single stage thing that just dries in the air in 2 hours. It doesn't have a hardener. So I'm also going to do an extra control. So I'm going to add a 5th glass of this to do as control, just to see how much of it disappears while drying. Interesting. The black acrylic doesn't really want to mix, it wants to settle out. And the same thing, it doesn't want to mix, it wants to settle out. Well, that's interesting. I just had a power outage. No matter. My lights can be powered by USB. Also note, it's discoloring the glasses because the solvents will actually eat away at the plastic. So it actually might eat through these cups. I didn't think about that before. Watercolor is dissolving into this. Right away we're getting a much better color. Okay, so it's been an hour and all of the 5-minute epoxy has hardened, and this one from the fiberglass has hardened. This is the one that had the jello in it, but the other ones from the fiberglass are still completely liquid. It should have hardened a long time ago. I've added hardener in twice more to these 3 and mixed it really well again, and they're not hardening at all. And fiberglass resin, when it hardens, should be exothermic. It should get hot, and this one got pretty hot. It's about 15 Celsius in here, and this got to about 25, but these never got above room temperature. So there might be something about the inks and paint that prevents these from hardening, but these haven't. These are still completely liquid, and like I said, I added hardener in twice. I don't think there's anything wrong with my tub of fiberglass because this one hardened just fine. The rest of these all hardened. A couple of these, the acrylic paint ones, are still a little bit soft. They're taking a lot longer to harden than the rest. So there's something about acrylic paint that slows the hardening process or prevents it entirely in the case of the fiberglass. So I'm going to ignore these, but these here are from the dollar store 5-minute epoxy, and the color turned out quite nice. You get this little translucent blue. Both of the blacks are very dark, and then the jello didn't really make a nice color, but it did give it kind of a bubbly texture. The other epoxy kind of made this weird blue-green color with the blue. The blacks turned out fine, and the jello kind of turned yellow. As far as the wood hardener, as I expected, they're all still liquid. And if we look at the control, it's lost quite a bit of mass. It's about halfway up to the mark I put. So it is losing quite a bit of mass like I expected. I'm going to leave these overnight and see what happens in the morning. Okay, so I let these sit for 24 hours. And let's look at the fiberglass resin here. It's starting to thicken up, but it's actually still not completely hard. I can put my fingerprint in there. So this is the black acrylic. Remember, I had to add in hardener twice more on these ones. Blue acrylic, it's thicker, but it's still kind of got a gel-like consistency. So I think these two will harden eventually, but it's definitely taking a long time. If you do decide to do this, make sure you have multiple days for your resin to harden. The watercolor is also thickening, but is still a liquid, I would consider it. And it's actually started eating through the cup a little bit. So the watercolor's out. The jello, it actually hardened up pretty much immediately, but the color is not very good. So I guess powdered inks might work better for this, but definitely not liquid acrylic paint or watercolor paint. Moving on to the dollar store 2-part epoxy. This actually worked quite well. The black acrylic is still just a little bit tacky, but it hardened up on day one pretty quick. The blue acrylic paint actually came out with a very nice color and hardened up properly the way through. It's a little bit inconsistent because some of the ink started separating it out before it hardened, but it made this really nice color, so I think this is a winner for color retention in my opinion. The watercolor also hardened up just fine and made a nice rich black. So I would say, once again, I would say the dollar store acrylic is the winner here. Dollar store with the jello, same thing as the fiberglass. It hardened pretty quickly. It's a little bit clearer than the fiberglass, but still not a very good color, so I wouldn't go this route myself. And as far as the Armor Coat $5 2-part epoxy, it also hardened up pretty well. It's still a little bit tacky. The blue didn't turn out quite as nice. I don't know if you can really see this on camera, but it's got a little bit of a green tint to it. So it turned out okay, but wasn't quite as nice. And it was a lot harder to work with. It was way, way, way thicker than the dollar store stuff. The watercolor worked pretty much just as well as the dollar store. And then again, same thing. Hardened up pretty well with the jello, but actually still a little bit tacky. I can still feel it's kind of sticky, but the color is pretty ugly. As far as the wood hardener, it is still not hardened, which I kind of expected. It's kind of a gel-like consistency now. It's lost a ton of mass, and as you can see, it started melting the cups. I mean, it's definitely not meant to be used as a epoxy or as a resin. It's meant to be used as a coating. The jello, this is the jello here. It came up with a very, very lovely color. So I think this is because the sugars in the jello dissolve better into the solvents of the wood hardener. So this might be a pretty good option as a final coat. I wouldn't use this as an epoxy or a resin by itself, but if you want to give this color to as a final coat, this might actually be a good option. The watercolors, the watercolor and the acrylic paints, they all kind of separated out, and they didn't really blend. Now it had a really nice, cool effect of it just kind of clumped in the bottom and hardened up there, which if that's an effect you wanted to go for, could be kind of cool. This looks like it worked, but if you look really closely, you can see it did separate out and just some of the ink leached out into the solvent. So unless you're trying to go for an effect like that, I would say the paints are a no-go. But the jello worked really, really well and would be a lovely final coat. My final verdict is don't mix paint with fiberglass resin. It doesn't work very well. Dollar store acrylic paint and dollar store epoxy works really well together, but not jello. The Armor Coat $5 epoxy didn't do very much better than the dollar store stuff, so I'm just going to stick with the dollar store stuff. And for the wood hardener, it's great as a final coat, which is what it's designed to do, but as a standalone product, it's not good for this application.